What would you do if your best friend suddenly started avoiding you, right after you almost told him the biggest secret of your life? David thought moving to a new town would be the hardest part of high school. He was wrong. The hardest part was Bennett, his best friend, the boy who made him feel understood, the boy who might never feel the same way. And when a stolen phone, hidden messages, and a heartbreaking misunderstanding threatened to destroy everything between them, David had to decide whether risking their friendship was worth risking his heart. Stay until the end, because one unexpected moment changes everything. David Parker never wanted to move to Cedar Ridge, Colorado. At 17, he already had a life back in Seattle. He had friends who knew him, favorite places he visited every weekend, and a routine that felt comfortable. Leaving all of that behind felt like losing a part of himself. His first morning at Cedar Ridge High started exactly how he expected: awkward, lonely, and exhausting. The hallways were packed with students who already knew where they belonged. Groups laughed together near lockers, couples walked hand in hand, and athletes proudly wore school colors. David felt invisible among them. He kept his head down as he entered his first class. The last thing he wanted was attention. As he sat near the window, organizing his notebooks, someone dropped into the empty seat beside him. "You're the new guy from Seattle, right?" David looked up. The boy sitting next to him had messy brown hair, warm hazel eyes, and the kind of easy smile that immediately put people at ease. "Yeah," David replied. "I'm Bennett Walker." "David." Bennett extended his hand. "Nice to meet you." David shook it. Something about Bennett's confidence felt natural instead of intimidating. Most people seemed interested in him because he was new. Bennett seemed interested because he genuinely wanted to know him. That difference mattered. By lunchtime, Bennett had already introduced him to half the school. David normally hated being the center of attention, but Bennett somehow made everything easier. When lunch ended, David realized something surprising. For the first time that day, he wasn't thinking about Seattle. Over the following weeks, their friendship grew naturally. They studied together after school, played basketball at the community center, shared playlists and movie recommendations. Sometimes they spent hours texting late into the night about everything and nothing. David found himself looking forward to seeing Bennett every morning. At first, he ignored the feeling. Then he tried explaining it away. Maybe he was just grateful to have a friend. Maybe he was still adjusting to his new life. Maybe that was all it was. But deep down, he knew the truth. The truth arrived every time Bennett smiled at him. Every time Bennett laughed at one of his jokes. Every time Bennett casually threw an arm around his shoulder while talking. David's heart reacted before his mind could stop it. And that scared him, because friendship was safe. Friendship was simple. The feelings growing inside him were neither. One Friday evening, after basketball practice, they sat alone on the football field watching the sunset. The mountains in the distance glowed orange and gold. For several minutes, neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable, easy, the kind of silence that only existed between people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. "You know," Bennett finally said, "when I heard someone new was moving here, I wasn't excited." David laughed. "That's encouraging. I'm serious." Bennett smiled. "I figured you'd be like everyone else." "What does that mean?" "You'd show up, make friends, and eventually disappear." David looked at him. There was something unexpectedly vulnerable in Bennett's expression. Something honest. "I'm not going anywhere," David said quietly. For a moment, Bennett simply stared at him. Then he smiled. A real smile. Not the casual one he gave everyone. This one felt different. "Good," Bennett said. Just one word. Yet somehow it stayed with David the entire night. Later, lying in bed, he replayed the conversation over and over. The way Bennett had looked at him. The way his voice had softened. The way being around him made everything feel lighter. David closed his eyes. For months he had been trying not to admit what was happening. Trying not to acknowledge feelings that seemed impossible. But denying them wasn't working anymore. The truth was simple. He liked Bennett. More than a friend. More than he wanted to admit. And if Bennett ever found out, everything could change. Their friendship. Their trust. Their connection. The thought terrified him. So David made a decision. No matter how strong his feelings became, he would keep them to himself. Some secrets were safer left unspoken. At least, that's what he believed. He had no idea that the months ahead would test that decision in ways he never imagined. The months passed faster than David expected. What had started as a simple friendship with Bennett had become the most important relationship in his life. Every morning began with a text from Bennett. Every lunch period ended with them sitting together. Every weekend somehow turned into another excuse to spend time side by side. To everyone else, they were simply best friends. David wished things were that simple. The problem wasn't Bennett. The problem was how David felt whenever Bennett was around. It was becoming impossible to ignore. One Friday night, they were working on homework in Bennett's room. Music played quietly in the background while rain tapped against the windows. David sat at Bennett's desk, pretending to focus on math equations. In reality, he couldn't stop watching Bennett. The way he pushed his hair back while concentrating. The way he laughed whenever he made a mistake. The way he smiled without even realizing it. "You've been staring at the same problem for 10 minutes, Bennett said. David quickly looked down. "No, I haven't." "You definitely have." Bennett laughed. "You want help?" "I think my brain stopped working." "That's because you're trying too hard." David smiled despite himself. Being around Bennett always made things easier. Even difficult days. Even complicated feelings. That was exactly why he was in trouble. The closer they became, the harder it was to keep his emotions hidden. Sometimes he wondered if Bennett noticed. Other times he convinced himself Bennett had no idea. Then moments happened that completely confused him. One afternoon during basketball practice, another student jokingly asked if they were dating. The question was meant as harmless teasing. Several people laughed. David felt his entire body freeze. Before he could react, Bennett casually threw an arm around his shoulders. "Sorry, man," Bennett joked. "David isn't my type." Everyone laughed. David forced himself to laugh too. But something inside him sank. He knew Bennett was joking. He knew nobody meant anything by it. Yet the words stayed with him for days. David hated himself for caring. After all, Bennett hadn't done anything wrong. The real problem was that David wanted something he couldn't have. Or at least he thought he couldn't. A few weeks later, Cedar Ridge High announced a technology competition. Students would compete in teams to design an app for local businesses. The winning team would earn scholarships and a trip to California. Naturally, David and Bennett signed up together. "Easy win," Bennett declared confidently. David laughed. "You're way too confident. And you're not confident enough. One of us has to be realistic." "Wrong." Bennett pointed at him. "One of us has to believe we can do impossible things." The words sounded simple. Yet David found himself thinking about them later. Because maybe Bennett wasn't talking only about the competition. Maybe David's biggest impossible thing wasn't winning a scholarship. Maybe it was believing someone like Bennett could ever return his feelings. As their project began, life seemed perfect until strange things started happening. Bennett became distracted. He answered texts later than usual. Sometimes he canceled plans without explanation. Other times he seemed lost in thought. David tried not to overthink it. But overthinking was exactly what he did. Had he done something wrong? Was Bennett tired of him? Was their friendship changing? The uncertainty ate at him. Then one afternoon things became even worse. David realized his phone was missing. At first he assumed he had misplaced it. But after searching everywhere, panic set in. The phone contained years of memories. Photos from Seattle. Family pictures. Private messages. Everything. The school administration eventually found the phone. But when David got it back, something felt wrong. Several photos were gone. Entire conversations had been deleted. Someone had clearly accessed it. Anger burned inside him. The entire school started talking about the incident. Rumors spread faster than facts. Everyone seemed to have a theory. And then David heard something that made his stomach drop. Bennett's name had become part of the rumors. According to several students, Bennett had been seen holding the phone. David refused to believe it. Bennett would never betray him. At least that was what he kept telling himself. Still, the doubt lingered. When he finally confronted Bennett after class, his friend's reaction wasn't what he expected. Bennett looked nervous, uncomfortable, almost guilty. "Tell me the truth," David said. Bennett sighed heavily. "It's complicated." David's heart sank. That wasn't an answer. "What does that mean?" "I can't explain everything right now." "Why not?" Bennett looked away. For the first time since they'd met, He seemed unable to meet David's eyes. And somehow that hurt more than anything else. The silence between them felt unfamiliar, painful, dangerous. David wanted to trust him. He really did. But trust becomes harder when answers disappear. As Bennett walked away that afternoon, David stood alone in the hallway, watching him leave. For the first time since moving to Cedar Ridge, he felt truly lost. Because the one person who had always been there for him suddenly felt farther away than ever. And deep down, David feared this was only the beginning of something much worse. The following weeks became some of the hardest David had experienced since moving to Cedar Ridge. The distance between him and Bennett kept growing. Not all at once. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But David noticed every little change. The unanswered texts, the canceled plans, the awkward silences that never used to exist. Every day felt different now. Wrong. As if something important was slowly slipping away and neither of them knew how to stop it. The worst part was not knowing why. David replayed every recent conversation in his head. Every joke, every text message, every moment. He searched for a reason Bennett might be upset with him, but he couldn't find one. One evening, he sat alone in his bedroom, staring at his phone. 3 messages to Bennett remained unread. Outside, rain tapped softly against the window. Inside, the silence felt overwhelming. His mother knocked gently before entering. "You've been in here all night." David forced a smile. "I'm fine." She raised an eyebrow. That's usually what people say when they're not fine. David looked away. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then he sighed. "I think I'm ruining a friendship." His mother sat beside him. "What happened?" "I don't know." That was the truth. He genuinely didn't know. The uncertainty hurt more than any answer could have. His mother studied him carefully. "Is this friendship important to you?" David laughed softly. "More than anything." The words escaped before he could stop them. His mother smiled gently. "Then don't give up on it." David nodded. But inside, he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep pretending everything was normal. Because there was another truth he hadn't told anyone. A truth he barely admitted to himself. He wasn't afraid of losing a friend. He was afraid of losing Bennett. There was a difference. A huge difference. And that difference was called love. The realization terrified him. For months, he had buried those feelings. Ignored them. Denied them. But they refused to disappear. Every time Bennett smiled. Every time their shoulders brushed while walking down a hallway. Every time Bennett called him first when something good happened. David's feelings only grew stronger. And now those feelings felt impossible to hide. A few days later, David and Bennett stayed after school to work on their technology competition project. The library was nearly empty. Only a few students remained scattered among the tables. For nearly an hour, they worked in silence. The tension between them was impossible to ignore. Finally, David closed his laptop. "We need to talk." Bennett looked up. His expression immediately became guarded. "About what?" "About whatever is going on with you." "Nothing. Just one word." But David didn't believe it. "Stop doing that." "Doing what?" "Acting like everything is normal." Bennett sighed heavily. "It is normal." "No, it isn't." For the first time, frustration entered David's voice. "You barely answer my messages." Bennett looked away. "You've been avoiding me." "I'm not avoiding you." "Then why does it feel like you are?" Silence. Again. Always silence. David's chest tightened. He hated this. Hated feeling like he was losing the most important person in his life. Most of all, he hated not knowing why. "Bennett, just tell me the truth." For a moment, it looked like Bennett might actually say something. His mouth opened, then closed again. Whatever words had been there disappeared. And that hurt, more than David expected, because suddenly a terrible thought entered his mind. Maybe Bennett knew. Maybe somehow he had figured it out. Maybe he knew exactly how David felt. The possibility made his heart pound. Everything suddenly made sense. The distance, the awkwardness, the avoidance. What if Bennett wasn't pulling away because of the phone incident? What if he was pulling away because of David? Fear washed over him. For a brief moment, he wanted to run. Instead, he stayed. Because part of him was tired. Tired of hiding. Tired of pretending. Tired of carrying feelings he could never share. The words rose inside him before he could stop them. "Bennett, I..." His voice caught. Bennett looked directly at him. The room felt impossibly quiet. David's heart hammered against his chest. This was it. The moment he had imagined 100 times. The moment he had spent months avoiding. One sentence. Just one sentence. And everything would change. He opened his mouth. But fear won. The words never came out. Instead, he looked away. I don't understand what's happening to us. Bennett's expression softened. For a second, David thought he saw sadness in his eyes. Real sadness. Not anger. Not disgust. Sadness. And somehow that confused him even more. Bennett grabbed his backpack. I have to go. That's it. I just need some time. David stood there speechless. Seconds later, Bennett walked away. The library doors closed behind him, and David was left alone. For several minutes, he didn't move. He simply stared at the empty doorway. His chest felt heavy. Everything inside him hurt. Not because Bennett had rejected him, because Bennett never even got the chance. David had been so close to telling the truth. So close. Yet fear had stopped him. Again, that night, he barely slept. The next morning wasn't any easier. Or the day after that. Bennett continued keeping his distance. And David became convinced his worst fears were true. Maybe Bennett had figured everything out. Maybe their friendship was already over. The thought followed him everywhere. Then something unexpected happened. A mutual friend named Olivia approached him after class. You know Bennett's miserable, right? David frowned. What? Olivia crossed her arms. He's been miserable for weeks. That made no sense. If he's miserable, then why is he avoiding me? Olivia shrugged. Maybe you should ask him. David watched her walk away. Her words stayed in his mind for the rest of the day, because they didn't fit the story he had been telling himself. If Bennett truly wanted nothing to do with him, why'd he seem unhappy too? That night, David sat awake staring at the ceiling. For the first time, doubt crept into his assumptions. Maybe he didn't know the truth after all. Maybe Bennett's silence wasn't rejection. Maybe there was another reason, another explanation, another secret. And if that was true, David needed answers. Because one thing had become painfully clear. No matter how hard he tried to deny it, he was in love with Bennett. And sooner or later, the truth was going to come out. The message arrived late on a Thursday night. David had been staring at his phone for almost an hour when the screen suddenly lit up. A text from Bennett. Just 4 words. Can we talk tomorrow? David's heart immediately started racing. For weeks he had wanted answers. Now he wasn't sure he was ready to hear them. He typed 3 different responses before finally sending one. Yeah, of course. The next day felt endless. Classes dragged. Teachers talked. Students laughed. But David barely heard any of it. His mind stayed fixed on one question. What did Bennett want to say? After school, Bennett texted him an address. It was a small lakeside park just outside Cedar Ridge, a place they had visited together several times before. By the time David arrived, the sun was beginning to set. The lake reflected shades of orange and gold. The evening air was cool and quiet. Bennett was already there, standing near the water, waiting. For a moment, David simply watched him. Weeks ago, this scene would have felt normal. Now it felt like the most important moment of his life. Bennett turned when he heard footsteps. Neither spoke immediately. The silence between them felt heavy, almost nervous. Finally, Bennett broke it. Thanks for coming. David forced a small smile. You asked. Bennett nodded. Then he looked out at the lake. For several seconds, he seemed to be searching for the right words. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded different, more vulnerable. I owe you an explanation. David's stomach tightened. This is about the phone. Partly. Bennett took a deep breath. I should have told you the truth from the beginning. David waited. The rumors weren't completely wrong. His heart sank. Bennett continued before he could respond. I had your phone. David stared at him. What? I found it after someone took it. Bennett looked ashamed. I thought I could handle the situation myself. Why wouldn't you just tell me? Because I was trying to protect someone. David frowned. Protect who? Bennett hesitated. Then he explained everything. A student had taken the phone as a stupid prank. Things got out of control. Messages were deleted. Photos disappeared. Bennett discovered what happened afterward and tried fixing it without involving David. Instead of helping, he only made things worse. The entire situation suddenly made sense. The rumors, the secrecy, the guilt, everything. You should have trusted me, David said quietly. I know. Bennett looked down. I'm sorry. For the first time in weeks, David could see genuine regret in his eyes. And somehow it became impossible to stay angry. The silence returned. But this time it felt different. Less hostile. More honest. David thought the conversation was over. Then Bennett surprised him. The phone wasn't the real reason I stayed away. David looked up. What? Bennett swallowed hard. The phone was an excuse. A knot formed in David's chest. If the phone wasn't the reason, then what was? Bennett laughed nervously. The sound held no humor. Only anxiety. I didn't know how to deal with everything. Deal with what? Bennett looked directly at him. For a second, neither moved. Neither looked away. The world seemed to disappear around them. The lake, the trees, the fading sunlight. Everything. Only Bennett remained. You matter to me, David. His voice was barely above a whisper. David's pulse hammered. I know. No. Bennett shook his head. You don't. The words hung between them. David felt like he couldn't breathe. Weeks of confusion. Weeks of heartbreak. Weeks of wondering. All leading to this moment. What are you saying? David asked softly. Bennett looked away before looking back again, as if gathering courage. I'm saying that things stopped feeling simple. David's heart nearly stopped. The sentence wasn't a confession, but it wasn't friendship either. It was something in between. Something real. Something frightening. Something hopeful. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then David took a step closer. Things stopped feeling simple for me, too. The moment he said it, relief washed through him. Not because he had confessed everything, but because he had finally spoken some part of the truth. Bennett stared at him, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled. A genuine smile. The smile David had missed more than he wanted to admit. You have no idea how happy I am to hear that. David laughed softly. I've spent weeks thinking you hated me. Hated you? Bennett shook his head immediately. David, that's the last thing I could ever do. The sincerity in his voice made David's chest tighten. For a long moment, they simply stood there, neither wanting the conversation to end, neither wanting to ruin the fragile honesty that had finally returned between them. The sky grew darker. The lights around the lake slowly flickered on. Still, neither moved. Finally, Bennett stepped closer. Close enough that David could see every detail of his face. Close enough that his heart started racing again. I missed you. The words were simple, but they meant everything. David smiled. I missed you too. The tension that had separated them for weeks finally began to disappear. Not all at once, but enough. Enough for them to laugh again. Enough for them to talk openly. Enough for them to remember why they had become best friends in the first place. As they walked around the lake together, conversation came naturally for the first time in weeks. They talked about school, the competition, their future plans, anything and everything. Yet beneath every word existed something new, something neither of them was fully ready to name. By the time they returned to the parking lot, the stars had appeared overhead. Neither seemed eager to leave. Finally, Bennett looked at him, his expression softer than David had ever seen. Can I ask you something? Sure. When all this happened, why didn't you give up on me? David smiled. Because the answer was obvious. Because it had always been obvious. Because you're worth fighting for. For a second, Bennett looked completely speechless. Then he stepped forward and wrapped David in a tight hug. A real hug. Not the casual, friendly kind. The kind that said more than words could. David hesitated only briefly before hugging him back. For several seconds, neither moved. Neither wanted to. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. And in that moment, David realized something. The night hadn't answered every question. Nothing was officially defined. Nothing had been promised. But everything had changed. Because the distance between them was gone. The walls were gone. The fear was fading. And for the first time since moving to Cedar Ridge, David allowed himself to believe something impossible. Maybe this story wasn't ending. Maybe it was only beginning. The weeks following that night at the lake felt different. Not dramatically. Not in a way that anyone else would immediately notice. But for David and Bennett, everything had changed. The awkward distance was gone. The unanswered messages were gone. The uncertainty that had haunted them for weeks slowly faded away. Now their conversations lasted late into the night again. Their laughter returned. And for the first time in months, Being together felt easy. Still, neither of them rushed anything. Whatever existed between them was important. Too important to risk by moving too fast. The technology competition soon became the center of their attention. Their project was finally coming together. Every afternoon, they stayed after school refining their presentation, fixing problems, and preparing for the final judging. One evening, they were working alone in Bennett's garage. Laptops open. Energy drinks scattered across the table. Hours had passed without either noticing. David leaned back in his chair. "I think my brain officially quit." Bennett laughed. "Good. Mine quit 2 hours ago." David smiled. Moments like this had become his favorite. Simple moments. Nothing dramatic. Just being together. At some point, Bennett looked across the table and caught David staring at him. Neither looked away. The silence felt different now. Comfortable. Meaningful. The kind of silence that carried emotions words couldn't fully explain. Bennett smiled first. "What?" David shook his head. "Nothing. That's a lie." "Maybe." The smile on Bennett's face widened. For a second, neither spoke. Then Bennett quietly said something that made David's heart stop. "I'm really glad you came to Cedar Ridge." David looked down, trying unsuccessfully to hide his reaction. Yeah. Bennett's voice softened. "I don't think this year would have been the same without you." David wasn't sure how to respond, because he felt exactly the same way. The competition arrived 2 weeks later. The entire school gathered in the auditorium to watch the final presentations. David felt nervous. Bennett looked completely relaxed. "As usual." "Stop worrying," Bennett whispered. "We've got this." David laughed. "You always say that." "Because I'm usually right." The presentation went better than either expected. By the end, students and teachers were applauding. Several judges complimented their work. When the winners were finally announced, they earned second place. Not first, but still enough to qualify for the scholarship award. The entire team celebrated. Pictures were taken. Teachers congratulated them. Friends cheered. Yet throughout the celebration, David kept noticing the same thing. Every time something exciting happened, Bennett looked at him first. Every single time. And somehow that mattered more than any trophy. A few days later, school ended for summer break. Most students were excited about vacations and road trips. David was excited about something much simpler. More time with Bennett. The two spent nearly every day together. They hiked mountain trails, played basketball, watched movies, drove through the countryside with music blasting through open windows. Sometimes they talked for hours. Other times they sat in comfortable silence. Neither seemed to mind. One warm evening in early summer, they drove to a scenic overlook above the town. The sun was beginning to set. The mountains stretched endlessly in the distance. Everything below glowed orange and gold. They sat on the hood of Bennett's truck, watching the sky slowly change colors. For a while, neither spoke. The moment felt too perfect to interrupt. Finally, Bennett broke the silence. "You ever think about the future?" David laughed softly. "All the time." "Me too." Bennett stared at the horizon. "Used to scare me." "What changed?" Bennett looked at him. "You." The answer came so quickly that David almost thought he imagined it. But Bennett wasn't joking. His expression was completely serious. David's heart pounded. "Bennett, I'm serious." He smiled nervously. "Before you moved here, everything felt predictable." David listened quietly. "Then you showed up and somehow made my life better." The words hit harder than Bennett probably realized. Months ago, David would have spent days replaying that sentence. Now he was hearing it directly, honestly, without fear, without confusion, just truth. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then David finally found the courage to say what he had wanted to say for so long. "You changed my life too." Bennett smiled, a real smile, the kind that always made David forget whatever he was thinking. For several seconds, they simply looked at each other. The world around them seemed strangely quiet. The distant town lights, the evening breeze, the fading sunlight. Everything else disappeared. Only Bennett remained. Only this moment. Slowly, Bennett reached for David's hand. Their fingers intertwined naturally, as if they had always belonged there. Neither pulled away. Neither wanted to. The simple gesture said more than words ever could. A feeling of peace settled over David. Not excitement, not nervousness. Peace. Because for the first time, he wasn't wondering how Bennett felt. He knew, and Bennett knew how he felt too. No secrets remained. No walls remained. Only honesty. Only trust. Only the connection they had spent months building. Bennett looked toward him, his eyes warm beneath the fading sunlight. "Can I tell you something?" "Always." Bennett smiled. "I think meeting you was the best thing that happened to me." David laughed softly. "You stole my answer. Then think of a better one." David shook his head. "I can't." The two sat together as darkness slowly settled across Cedar Ridge, neither in a hurry to leave, neither wanting the night to end. Because after everything they had survived, the misunderstandings, the fear, the distance, and the uncertainty, they had finally arrived at something real, something worth protecting, something worth fighting for. As the stars appeared overhead, David realized that the biggest risk he had ever taken wasn't moving across the country. It wasn't starting over. It wasn't opening his heart. The biggest risk had been believing someone could truly understand him. And somehow Bennett did. The future remained uncertain. College applications, new opportunities, big decisions, an entirely new chapter waiting ahead. But for the first time, David wasn't afraid of what came next. Because whatever challenges the future brought, he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't be facing them alone. Bennett squeezed his hand gently. David smiled, and together they watched the stars fill the Colorado sky, ready for whatever came next. The end.